Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for joining this evening's session of talking about socialism from a Marxist point of view. My name is Nick Wrack. I'm one of the organisers of Talking About Socialism. We have these meetings every fortnight on a Monday evening at 7:30. This meeting will last until 9 o'clock, so we've got an hour and a half. This evening's session, we've got Ed Potts, who's spoken before and has written quite a few articles for our website. He's going to introduce a discussion on Die Linke, the left party in Germany. Has it contributed anything positive to the struggle for socialism? I'm not going to say anything more about it, leaving it for Ed to develop his points. Ed's going to speak for just over 15 minutes. And the way that we normally organize these discussions is that everybody has 3 minutes. And the purpose of that is to make sure that everybody can comment, has the opportunity to comment. And then we go around again if we've got time. And I think this evening we should have time. So we're also going to be recording this meeting, this discussion, and it will go up on YouTube. So bear that in mind with your camera, or if you say anything, it will be recorded. So what I'm going to do now is, again, thank you for coming. Please do contribute, comment, ask any questions. But without delaying any further, I'm going to hand over to Ed. Thanks, Ed.
Well, thanks very much, Nick. The starting point for this discussion is really the talk that was recently given by Chris Strafford for this series, and he spoke on the problem with so-called broad parties of the left, of which many have emerged throughout Europe in the last 20 years. The UK, of course, is the exception rather than the rule, perhaps in not having one of those parties, but it is an idea which has its advocates here. These new parties have typically been based around a nucleus of the old official communist parties or post-communist forces emerging out of them, sometimes drawing in splits from the left wing of social democracy and the intervention of other small left groups. So key examples have been Front de Gauche and its successors in France, Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, and of course Die Linke in Germany. And it's this, the last of those, which I'll focus on in tonight's introduction. The statement, who we are and the ideas that guide us, which is on the Talking About Socialism website, puts forward a vision of a mass communist party with its overarching aim being the complete transformation of society. And for reasons which I think should be clear already, or at least will emerge and become clear during this discussion, that party, I think, would look very different from Die Linke and other similar broad parties. But as communists, we're part of the wider working class movement, and there will, of course, be an ongoing process of discussing with others in the movement, seeking to persuade people of our approach, and the idea of a broad party which doesn't oppose capitalism itself, but rather merely sets itself up in opposition to neoliberalism or austerity, is an idea which comes up time and time again. And so it's worth us examining the historical examples of this phenomenon, this type of broad party, and learning from its lessons. So a brief overview of the history of Die Linke. It was formed essentially as a merger of two organizations between 2005 and 2007. The first and larger of the two was called the Party of Democratic Socialism, or PDS. That party emerged from the ashes, really, of the Stalinist ruling party of East Germany. There was a seminal moment in its formation at one of its founding congresses when a leading figure made a declaration that we break irrevocably with Stalinism as a system. And that line, that phrase, is still cited as a fundamental principle of Die Linke up till today. Between 1990 and 2005, the PDS struggled to establish itself in the Old West of Germany, but did retain a strong following in the Old East. The Old West, of course, lacked a significant left-wing force. This was by design rather than by accident. But that began to change in the early 2000s when the coalition government of the Social Democrats and the Greens began to implement an austerity program known as Agenda 2010. Certain long-standing activists and trade unionists became increasingly dissatisfied with the direction that was being taken, and they eventually split to form a new party called the Electoral Alternative for Labour and Social Justice. This went on to stand in a joint alliance with the PDS in 2005, and the two forces merged in the next couple of years. Following the merger, Die Linke did show promise initially in electoral results. In 2009, it won 11.1% of the vote, which gave it 76 seats in the Bundestag, Germany's federal assembly. However, that has been followed in the years since by a long period of decline punctuated by crises. As well as the federal assembly, Germany also has 16 federal states, which each have their own parliament. At that level, Die Linke has had significant successes, but those electoral successes have exposed serious contradictions and confusion about what the party is actually for. Die Linke has been part of the state-level government in no fewer than 4 states as a junior coalition partner to the Social Democrats, which is, of course, the party whose neoliberal agenda Die Linke was actually founded to oppose in the first place. In the state of Thüringen, Die Linke's support rose steadily, such that from 2014 onwards, it was able to become the leading partner rather than junior partner in a coalition government with the Social Democrats and the Greens. It's worth also noting that Die Linke is a multi-tendency party, so it's not homogenous. It contains within it a variety of different formal and informal currents and tendencies and caucuses. It would be impossible to go into all of them here, we don't have time, but I think it is important to note that the reformist wing of the party, or the so-called governmental socialist wing, which focuses on winning elections and forming a government, at least at state level, those forces do have their internal critics within the party who try to hold them accountable and advance alternative politics, whether that be simply further left criticisms or even openly Marxist politics within the party. Perhaps the greatest irony and one of the most difficult things to understand about Die Linke is that despite emerging from a movement against austerity, it does itself have a long history of implementing austerity at the state and the local level wherever it's held office. One member of the internal caucus called Anti-Capitalist Left described it in this way, saying in Berlin, Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, Brandenburg and Thüringen, so various states of Germany, the balance sheet of government participation by Die Linke is clear. In the best case, Thüringen, participation in government has simply reinforced a stagnant political status quo. In all the other cases, Die Linke has been jointly responsible for serious political errors, brown coal mining, police laws, deportations, cuts to public services, constriction of trade union rights, privatization, the list goes on and on. In fairness, Die Linke did agree at one of its conferences a series of very basic red lines, basically saying that it wouldn't enter into governments which had an agenda of privatization, cuts to services, or attacks on working class living standards. But this has been very, very weakly enforced and really not respected in terms of the way that Die Linke has behaved when it has been in government. And so there is internal debate about it, but the record for an anti-austerity party, its record in regard to actually opposing austerity in practice has not been a good one, to say the least. Now, all of this has really fed into a general loss of momentum, general loss of support for the party, and as I said, a slow decline of Die Linke over the years, which has been accelerated at various points by internal and external crises that have cropped up around this or that issue. I want to just touch briefly on the Die Linke's position with as regards the German state and how it how that relation works, because of course it has its roots partially in the East German state, the East German ruling party. But today's Germany is not a new creation, a new country, but effectively an enlarged West Germany. And Die Linke occupies a quite uncomfortable and ambiguous position in that new Germany with regard to the constitution and the state apparatus. You might describe it as a tolerated opposition. Sections of Die Linke and certain individual members are under observation, under surveillance by the so-called Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, which is effectively a secret police force which keeps under surveillance and monitors those forces which are said to be or suspected of being hostile to the free democratic order of the state. Now, this surveillance is, of course, primarily a means of the establishment keeping an artificial lid on Die Linke's levels of support by tainting it with its antecedents in the East German dictatorship. But significantly, Die Linke's opposition to that isn't and hasn't historically been to agree that it does wish to bring down the constitutional order and replace it and explain why, but instead their response is generally to deny this and to retort simply that the state should be directing its persecution and its surveillance elsewhere, in particular towards the far right. In a parliamentary debate in 2012, which you can watch on YouTube if you're so inclined, the Conservative Minister of the Interior at the time justified the state surveillance of the party by saying that Die Linke, or in any case sections of it, expresses in public remarks and literature their support for the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat of a Marxist-Leninist kind and for a communist system in this country. The response of Die Linke's parliamentary fraction on the benches was essentially to fall about in exaggerated laughter, trying to expose what a ludicrous suggestion this was. And I think that's important because we should see in that not a tactical response or savvy PR, but actually an honest reflection of what the overall politics of Die Linke is and of parties like it. These parties are not opposed to the capitalist system and its constitutional order. They have no meaningful perspective for the kind of comprehensive transformation of society that would be required to bring about communism, which is certainly the aim that we're striving towards. Even if it were merely a tactical response to try and avoid or to delegitimize state repression, ultimately the effect of miseducating people about the party's proper attitude towards the capitalist state really outweighs any short-term benefit that might be achieved by so-called good PR. I'm going to touch briefly, because it's a party which has enjoyed some electoral successes and has quite an extensive use of elections and the parliamentary tactic. It's worth touching on the position of Die Linke in relation to the working class that it seeks to organise and represent at state and federal level. So to give you some figures to put things in context, members of the Bundestag, Germany's federal assembly, receive a salary of 10,591 euros a month. That is separate from their office expenses and everything of that kind. So it's their personal salary, 10,591 euros a month. Members of state parliaments, state assemblies, receive at least 6,000 euros a month, and it's often higher depending on the state. Now, this is against a context where Die Linke has most representatives at state level in the old eastern states of Brandenburg, Saxon-Anhalt, and Thüringen. Now, in those states, in the old East Germany, gross average income, or average wages, I should say, remains stuck at around 3,500 euros a month. And that is a whole €1,000 a month lower than the richer cities in Germany and the old West German states, where average wages are more like 4,500 or more. So there's a €1,000 gap if you live in the Old East compared to the Old West. And what this amounts to, of course, is that elected representatives of Die Linke receive several €1,000 a month more than the people that they purportedly represent in Parliament. And the situation's worst in the poor regions where they have the most support. Now, of course, doubtless many parliamentarians for Die Linke do contribute diligently and generously of their own volition to strike funds and other good causes, but it's significant, I'd say, that there's no obligation on them to do so. And in contrast, of course, what communists should be advocating, and communists within Die Linke do advocate and call for, is for elected representatives, socialists in parliament, to take only the average wage of an average worker that they represent. And the point isn't to make a fetish of a vow of poverty, but to impress upon those who serve our movement that they're accountable to the people who put them there, and that the only success they should be striving towards isn't career success or individual success, but collective success, the success of the revolution. The fact that no such rule is imposed in the case of Die Linke is really a sign that the party, another sign that the party has no perspective of a system beyond capitalism. All they can see really is tinkering with the status quo. It's worth mentioning briefly Die Linke's over-reliance historically on its most prominent politicians. The one that's talked about most at the moment is Sarah Wagenknecht, who's perhaps done more than anyone to accelerate the party's long-term decline and send it over the edge of a cliff, potentially into a damaging split. The breaking point, the catalyst for all of this, has been the desire of Wagenknecht, who was one of the leaders of the party for many years, to accommodate the increasing support for right-wing anti-immigrant views, which are increasing in support. She spent 6 years trying to forge a realignment of the left into an undemocratic, leader-centric formation, similar perhaps to La France Insoumise in France. And her first attempt at this was a flop, but now finally relations between her and Die Linke have broken down, and she's finally left the party, taking 10 of their Federal Assembly members with her. The net effect of this essentially may be an existential crisis for Die Linke. It may well fail to attain the threshold to be represented in the Bundestag at the next elections. So it's really crunch time. I'm nearing the end now, so I'm going to just draw together some points and suggest some lessons that can be learnt from the experience of Die Linke. So firstly, breaking irrevocably with Stalinism as a system, I'd suggest that was a significant moment. It is and was positive, and it's important that we are able to continue to break down the illusions and the deformities that Stalinism introduced into the communist movement. I think that kind of approach should inform the way that we approach our discussions with others on the left, who might have very different or mistaken ideas, and of course also those who are not on the left at all and might have openly reactionary ideas. All of us are capable of change, and our job as communists is to form a great army of agitators to patiently explain, to convince, and to persuade. Second, broad parties like Die Linke, clearly through the historical experience, we can see that they don't offer a constructive model for advancing the struggle for socialism. The dynamic of parties is always to arrive at a lowest common denominator politics, expressed merely as the fight for simple reforms like higher wages, and not necessarily achieving even that. However, the idea of broad parties is one that comes up time and time again, and we need to engage with advocates of that idea to explain why a halfway house between reform and revolution ultimately ends up achieving neither, and to put forward something better, and that is a mass communist party with the aim of communism put front and centre of all its campaigning, which seeks to win power to end capitalism, not to manage it, not participating in governmental coalitions with capitalist parties, not administering cuts or seeking to simply soften attacks on working class living standards, but to engage, persuade people of communist ideas and draw them into the fight for communism, and to direct itself towards that purpose. And so that's the fundamental difference between what we are building the idea of and the experience of parties like Die Linke. So I'm going to end it there.
Thank you very much, Ed. That's a really thorough review of Die Linke and the pitfalls of broad left parties encapsulated in that one example. So I'm going to open it up for contributions, comments, questions. I want to welcome particularly those of you who have not been to one of these meetings before. Please don't hesitate to put your hand up. You can indicate, please, by raising the little hand, the yellow hand at the bottom of your screen. If you can't find it, wave your hand and I hope I'll see you. So Ed's raised a lot of points, both particular and general. Who wants to come in and say anything at all? And just to remind you, all questions are good because they stimulate discussion, debate. And if you've got a difference with Ed or with anybody else that speaks, again, don't hesitate to come in, because debate and difference help to clarify. So I'm going to call in Minnie first.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Ed, for the talk on Die Linke. Don't know much about them. Just come on to pose a quick question, really. Just put my hand up to pose a quick question. I know there's been massive demonstrations in Germany recently against Alternative for Deutschland. And I also understand that when pro-Palestinians try to join that march, against what's going on in Israel, against the slaughter of the Palestinians, a lot of them, there's this anecdotal evidence and people saying they were pushed out, they didn't want the flags there. So I understand also that the German government has some really tough legislation on immigration. So I'm just wondering, how much, or did Die Linke have anything to do with that march? Were they involved? Be interested to know. Thanks.
Thanks, Minnie. I'll call Ed back after there's been a few questions or comments. So who else would like to comment or contribute? Will, did I see your hand go up there?
Yeah, it was just, I mean, just more of a question really, which is that I too was wondering about those demonstrations that Minnie brought up, and I was in my mind, my assumption was that Die Linke would be involved in them, and that they'd be quite central to them. And you'd imagine an organisation that was premised on the premise that Die Linke is there, that's what they would be doing. And I don't know the answer to that question, so it's really a question for Ed. But the other thing that I really wanted to know about, to be honest, is clearly they've managed to maintain the ability for people to have different groups and different political lines in the party. And you were mentioning the fact that there were communists in Die Linke who were arguing something that, I don't know whether you thought we would approve of it, but something that was far more along the lines that we would argue for. So I'm just wondering, just as a question, really, who are they, and what's their orientation? And also, kind of a separate one similar to Minnie's one, which is the question about what's Die Linke's orientation to those demonstrations, because Germany seems to me to be in a very weird place politically at the moment. It's kind of the home of Marxism in one sense, is it not? I mean, when I went to Germany last year, I went to the museum, the Karl Marx Museum. You see all this history, but we have a situation where there are demonstrations where people are being driven off for supporting the Palestinian cause. Supposedly demonstrations against the far right, and I just think there's something very peculiar going on in that country, and I'm curious as to what it might be.
Good questions, Will. Again, if I can encourage people to, if you want to broaden it out to the lessons that you might want to suggest should be applied to Britain, again, don't hesitate. Matthew.
Thanks, Clyde. Yeah, no, just sort of volunteer. I think, and the thing about Die Linke, of course, is that, as you say, they've been in government in a number of places, and of course their record of government's terrible. Both in terms of carrying out the cuts, and particularly obviously in most notably in Berlin, where they were part of the coalition with the Greens and the SPD, but also in Thuringia and other places. And the other thing, of course, that they've done is deportations. I mean, it's extraordinary. You think, well, okay, so any kind of left party would not be involved in the deportation of people, but no, they have, and they've carried this out, and obviously this aligns with Wagneff's move to the basically to appease the far right, but in practice it's been done by Die Linke in government. The other interesting thing, I think, is also that the degree of split in Die Linke also, of course, includes the left groups who've been in many cases have been in there for over a decade. So the biggest of which, of course, is Marx 21, which is the co-thinkers of basically the co-thinkers of the SWP. And Marx 21 itself was split in 3 bits. Strangely enough, one bit of which has gone on, it basically forms itself as aligns with the trade union bureaucracy. Interesting enough, something in common with a chunk of the SWP itself in this country, and has got itself nice jobs in the trade unions. There's also a sort of left bit that got thrown out. I mean, there's a thing it actually split in all these bits, but the first thing they did was throw out the left. So you've only now got a movement to the left out of both Marx 21 and Die Linke. And the interesting thing will be what the realignment is, because clearly, obviously, the whole thing is disintegrating. I mean, you can see also, as you say, that the issue, the Palestine issue, has been very sharp, because obviously the German government sees support for Israel as a central plank of the very existence of the German state. So, I mean, in some places, particularly Berlin and also elsewhere, that you can be arrested for carrying a Palestinian flag or wearing a kufiya or other such signs that you might be supporting the Palestinians or be Palestinian, even if you are Jewish, and many of the organisers of demonstrations are Jewish, and therefore.
Matthew, can you bring that? If you bring
yes,
that,
okay, all right, yeah,
that's great. Come back. I'm sure there'll be time for you to come back a second time. Having cut Matthew off, I hope there's other people going to put their hands up. Otherwise we'll get him back for another 3 minutes. I'm sure there are lots more questions, but also perhaps what do people think of the strategy of Die Linke? Is that the way that the socialist left should work? I mean, is there a contradiction, for example, between trying to win elections and fighting for socialist policies? Can you not do both? Do you always have to water down your program if you want to win people to follow you? Is our criticism of broad left parties misplaced? So I'd be very interested, I'm sure Edward as well, to hear what people think about that. Or it may be that people like Toby and Jane in Italy have got something to say about their own experiences there. I'm going to call in Soraya while people are thinking. So Soraya.
Yeah, sorry, I've got a very sore eye, which is why I've had my camera off. Just a quick contribution, really. I think that the problem there isn't a problem with parties standing in elections, but when they lose sight, well, firstly, I don't think that the changing of society will necessarily come about by a cumulative effect of MPs in Parliament, but it is a way of important to participate, to get the word across to people that whom you would perhaps normally not be able to reach. But I think the problem that there's been in the past and still is that parties do that perhaps with the best intentions starting out and then become a mere electoral machine, and they're so focused on getting, on the one hand, of course, if you can get elected, great, but on the other hand, if you just focus on that, there can be a tendency, which we've seen in different countries all over the world, of being so focused on electoral success that you think, well, that's got to be the end of our final aim, and therefore the watering down of programs and ideas with the excuse of oh, well, we've got to get elected and you've got to have ideas that appeal to people, instead of saying, well, people may not agree with us now, but we believe this is the way for society to be changed and for people's lives to be changed definitively, and therefore we don't water that program down, that it gets supplanted by the whole aim of a party being to be electoral machine to get people elected. And I think somebody asked a question, I can't remember who it was, but I think what we're seeing, the examples that comrades gave of events in Germany isn't that, I ask a question, isn't that part of a wider of what we're seeing, a success for not just right-wing but far right-wing parties electorally, and because of the failure of so-called socialist or communist parties, the far right are getting electoral success. So you've got a situation where in Italy you've got Meloni as the prime minister, which you would have thought would have been impossible given the history of Italy, and other countries, very similar things happening, and it is a warning for us.
Thanks very much, Soraya. That came in just 10 seconds underneath, so that's excellent. Who's going to come in next? Do any of the people I've got? Is that Jane's hand on at Toby Ennis? Toby Absey? I'll call in whoever's at Toby's place with their hand up. but you need to unmute yourself.
There you go.
Unmuted now.
Okay. The thing I was originally going to ask was about this Sarah Wagenknecht. I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, but anyway, you know who I mean. That her line on immigration is obviously absolutely terrible, but I'm not clear whether the description. I don't know a great deal about what is currently going on in Germany, but I mean, her movement or party, whatever it is, been described as red-brown, and I don't know whether that is actually quite fair or not. Is it as bad as that? The other thing that I sort of feel quite strongly, living in a country with a fascist prime minister, and I do regard her as a fascist, and this label of post-fascist is ridiculous. She's absolutely unrepentant, but she's just cunning and is taking her exemplary is Orban. I mean, the Hungarian model is the way to proceed if you're within the EU. You don't, do it in the way you might have done in the 20s or 30s of last century, but you do it like that. And it's quite clear, as we've seen in this recent case of Ilaria Salis, which some of you may have heard about, this Italian anti-fascist who's in a Hungarian jail. I won't go into that in great detail, but it is shown the extent to which she is absolutely at one with Orban. But my feeling is that the fact that there were mass demonstrations in Germany against the AfD is a positive thing, because there wasn't mass opposition on the streets to Maloney in the period of the last general election. And some of the far left who thought they were going to, do something, say, in Naples, and then they chickened out of it. And they said it would be counterproductive if they were a bit violent against her rally there. Well, they could have. She was going into a working class quarter, and it could have been disrupted, I think. And I also feel the whole period. I mean, look, she started off with 2% and then went up to 4% and 6%. I mean, they could have been smashed in the egg, to use an old phrase about fascists. Anyway, look, what I'm saying is I think that there is a serious danger in Germany now of the AfD making massive headway. I mean, look, we've seen what we have in Italy. We've seen what we've seen in the Netherlands. We've seen the advance of Le Pen in France. And I do think, though I'm sympathetic to the notion that we should be fighting for communism, I think at the moment that it's this fascist advance that we've got to be afraid of.
That was just spot on, Toby. So thank you very much. And it's great to hear a perspective from Italy. I think you're in Rimini, are you?
No, Livorno.
Okay, all right, great.
Where the original Communist Party was founded.
That's what I thought. Thanks. So who's going to come in next? I'm just trying to see if anybody's got. Okay. Well, I'm going to bring myself in if nobody else has got their hand up. I'm going to put a timer on, because I think I'm just going to try to develop some of the points that Toby made and perhaps take a different tack, because Toby's last question posed the question, what's the main task that we've got on the left? Is it fighting for communism, or is it fighting against fascism? And I actually think that the two are inextricably bound. And I think what we've seen in Germany in the last couple of months is a reflection of the complete polarization that's beginning, already well on its way. Toby makes a good point about the mass demonstrations against the AfD. I don't know if people know, I think it was November or December, there was a far right meeting, the AfD met with some Nazis and had a conference at a hotel in Potsdam, at which they basically discussed how to introduce mass deportations and get rid of all the so-called undocumented asylum seekers and refugees and so on. And this came to light, and that's provoked these demonstrations. And the organizers, as far as I understand, and perhaps Ed will correct me, but they didn't expect much of a turnout at all. And over Germany, 1 million people turned out on a single day. And the organizers were overwhelmed in Munich and in Berlin and elsewhere. And what it shows is that people are horrified and frightened of the rise of the far right. But the question then arises, well, how do you defeat the far right? Is it possible to undercut the AfD if all you're saying, and I'm not suggesting that Toby was saying this, but this is the reaction of the SPD and sections of Die Linke and the liberals in Germany, is basically to defend the status quo. But it's the status quo that has led to the rise of the AfD, in my opinion. It's the fact that you've got austerity, it's blamed on immigrants, the divide and rule, using the asylum seekers and the refugees as a focal point to win support from those who have no job, who have low pay, who don't have a decent place to live. This is easy, and that's what's happening. And every time an established politician from the SPD or Sarah Wagenknecht, which is what she's done, she's basically suggested that more needs to be done to curb immigration, to get rid of asylum seekers. That's me stopping. And what it does is it fuels the AfD, who are the people that are really talking about it. So I'll leave it there for perhaps people to come in and disagree or develop the point, and I'll try to come back in another round. So who's going to come in next? What I'm going to do then, I'm going to ask Ed to come back on some of the questions that have been raised and try to answer those points, and then we'll open it up again. But it's just a request and a suggestion. Don't hesitate. If you've got a question, you disagree with anything that's been said, do put your hand up and say it. So Ed.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Well, I think the current rise of the far right in Germany is a recurring theme which many people touched on. So maybe if I address that first, many raised the demonstrations in Germany, but also that pro-Palestine sentiment in Germany is heavily policed. And efforts are made to exclude it. And Matthew quite rightly identified that support for the state of Israel is a linchpin of the German state's existence and political understanding. That, however, is also shared by the whole spectrum, effectively, of German politics, including Die Linke. And so support for Palestine and criticism of Israel is far more muted or even excluded and deemed unacceptable in left-wing circles in Germany than is the case in this country and many other countries in Europe. And at its core, it's because the even people on the left in Germany have accepted the official state position, which is that the German state and German society as a whole bear a historical responsibility and therefore have an obligation to support and defend the state of Israel. And so that's what's at the root of that. And that is the reason why even in left-wing circles, that those sentiments are routinely excluded and minimised. In terms of the recent developments with the AfD, I think what's most concerning, in a sense, the mass demonstrations that have been referred to. Yes, Die Linke was part of those and supportive of them, along with pretty much all forces from the centre to the left, so including the Social Democrats and the Greens, and so it was as broad a front as, I suppose, Unite Against Fascism is in this country, in the sense that it's not by any means a class struggle anti-fascist perspective, but rather a rejection of the AfD and what it represents, at least partially on the basis of the status quo in defence of the constitutional order, which we keep coming back to. Toby asked whether it's fair to describe the AfD as red-brown, whether it's fair to describe Zara Wagenknecht's new formation as red-brown. So to expand on that a little, Zara Wagenknecht has for the last 5+ years been advocating a line on immigration, and in particular Angela Merkel's response to the refugee crisis, essentially saying that the left has it wrong on the question of migration and how it normally approaches issues of anti-racism, and in her opinion that the left generally talks down to deprived so-called native working class communities, who are those who bear the brunt of the impact on services and resources that migration brings with it, in her analysis. And so that is the general thrust of her argument. What it translates to, of course, is cheap and opportunistic attacks on migrants as a whole, cynically exploiting the real rise of xenophobia within Germany and beyond, hoping to ride on the coattails of those forces like the AfD, who exist, for whom anti-migrant politics is a core plank of their platform. Is it fair to describe it as red-brown? I think it probably misses something to use that way of describing Zara Wagenknecht and people like her, because ultimately, I think I would say it's a cynical maneuver. It's reprehensible for all that, but its motivation is ultimately a vote-winning one. Zara Wagenknecht and people like her are nothing if not consummate politicians, and I think this is essentially the latest thing that they think that they can exploit in order to win votes, rather than having any genuine heritage or closeness which brings them closer to the far right as such. So I think it's important to be precise and careful when we analyse and use those kinds of descriptors, but I don't think it makes the general sort of line of her politics any less reprehensible or worthy of criticism. Nick raised whether it's possible to defeat the AfD by defending the status quo, and that's a very interesting problem that Die Linke is in fact grappling with right now, because of course it's beyond this pressing, urgent issue of the rise of the far right. It's not a party, as I've said, that has a perspective of ending capitalism, of a different form of society beyond capitalism, and that inevitably limits the way it responds to the far right. It has sought to differentiate and distinguish itself from the establishment by putting out, only in the last couple of days, putting out a so-called immediate program against the AfD, which essentially criticizes the establishment parties for being part of the problem, saying that the reason, or one of the reasons behind the growth of the AfD, has been the lack of investment in people's services, in the fabric of working class people's lives, and this has fueled the rise of the far right. And what we need, therefore, is a program of investment, a reversal of cuts and of austerity measures. But two things to say about that. One is, of course, it only goes so far, because all they can propose really are ameliorative reforms to tinker around the edges of the economy. They don't say that the problem's capitalism and this is why this is happening. And the other is that Die Linke is in fact getting behind calls that are emerging for the German state, in the guise of its Office for the Protection of the Constitution, which I mentioned earlier. There are calls for that to begin a process of banning the AfD, formally prohibiting it as a party, which would be an astonishing step for a party which 5 odd million people in Germany have voted for, and is on course to become the second largest party potentially in the next Bundestag. So that would be an astonishing step for the state to take, but even more astonishing, perhaps, that socialists should be lining up behind the capitalist state and calling on it to exercise its power to simply ban political parties that we don't like, of course, which completely ignores the very obvious danger that they will be next. That the capitalist state, if given that power, if that sort of exercise of its authority becomes the norm, then it will very naturally seek to use it against Die Linke or any other forces that pose any kind of threat. So yeah, I'm going to leave it there. I've gone on too long.
No, not at all, Ed. That's great. Thanks very much, because Matthew and Will have got their hands up. So I'm going to call in Matthew first, and then Will. Also draw people's attention, as we've just had a comment from Sol Sanders Farmer, who's come to first time he's been to our meeting, I think. Have to head off, and apologies for not contributing, but have been stuck at work late. I wanted to say I really enjoyed the discussion, really useful. I've been meaning to catch up with the developments in Die Linke. So good, let's keep the discussion going then. So Matthew.
Yeah, I think that, obviously this is a greater importance in terms of, as Tony's pointing out, in terms of development of fascism. Now, if you look at what people are actually present at the Potsdam meeting, the infamous Potsdam meeting, it's AfD. It's actually two members of the CDU, the Conservative CDU party, which has governed Germany over a whole period of time. It's a whole series of business people, so a bit of the ruling class itself, and it goes beyond merely attacking immigrants. What they were talking about is, okay, we want to throw out those people who've arrived to seek asylum, but we also want to throw out a chunk of of people who support them, i.e. the left. And of course, those people actually hold, further, those people who hold German passports. So it's what they call remigration. So I mean, it's actually quite a fundamental thing, and it ties in with what Trump's program, which Trump is saying, okay, we will attack immigrants, we will attack the left, and the whole piece. So it's not just sort of casual thing. It actually lines up across on a global basis, and you can see. I mean, the thing is, all of this is coordinated as well, because I mean, obviously, through the likes of Bannon and company, the far right is meeting across various things, and through Orban, of course, who has held these conferences of the far right in Hungary and including obviously the Trumpite far right, and so on, and with a considerable fascist element. So obviously this is serious. Now, I mean, the thing is that I think in Italian terms, I mean, the interesting about Meloni in Italian terms, of course, is that she's almost the last person standing, because every other, all of the political forces basically have bowed down before neoliberalism. Look at obviously the PCI, most of all, the Communist Party, collapses in the early 90s after the end of the Soviet Union, collapses into administrating neoliberalism against the working class. And so and all of its different bits and pieces have done the same. Whenever they've got anywhere near government, they've gone into government, they've administered the usual shite. The interesting thing about what the fascists have done in those terms, and Meloni, of course, is a serious fascist. I mean, she said, she has this from when she was young, and so on, and she's attacked people who've gone off against fascists. But what the fascists have done is to remove their street legions. And they've done this in Italy in order to get into government. They've done it in Sweden in order to get into government. So you're seeing, a different thing. Again, Orban, has not used a street legion, so it's not classic fascism by any means. But what it is a serious. What we will see is a serious attack. And obviously, I think that the key will be the fact that at the moment it looks like Trump will get elected, because there are people just ain't going to vote for Genocide Joe. It ain't happening. The choice between the two, Trump will win. So and that, of course, then motivates her all the rest of it. So it's going to get interesting in those terms. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Matthew. You came in at 20 seconds under there. So Will.
Yeah, that was interesting. I think mainly looking at the broad left parties and thinking about what's going on around us. Really, it's the case that what's happened with various kind of broad left formations has just served to demonstrate that left social democratic politics, even dressed up as socialism, don't convince at a mass level. They don't represent an alternative to the development of capitalism in its many disastrous forms. And it's just not an effective argument to win mass support over time. But at the same time, it does pose a question for socialists and communists about what kind of political program and what kind of party program would galvanize that. If we believe, and I do, that it's possible to organize a mass organization on that basis, what's the program? What would communists be saying in this period? What would we be saying about? I mean, Soraya brought up the question of standing in elections, and the dangers of electoralism. So what would we be saying in those circumstances, and what would we be arguing for, confronting this kind of capitalism, which is it's so rotten and decaying. We're going to be living in a very problematic period. So what would our position be? And I think in that context of the failure of those kind of broad left social democratic politics dressed up as socialism in a way, is that all the kind of parties, all the kind of the bourgeois order, basically, in Europe in particular, and maybe the United States as well, is coming under massive pressure from the change in the world order and the change in the world economy, and the inter-imperialist conflict which we can see taking place before us. And it does in Europe, because basically, it does in Europe. You have several economies that are not as strong as they were. They can't provide the welfare state settlement under capitalist terms that they did. They're certainly, having gone around the world creating wars, are no longer prepared to accept the influx of migrants and want to drive them out, right? What is our answer to all of this? And at the moment, we're in a really difficult position. And I can only see a sharp turn to the right. I mean, Matthew, a couple of meetings ago, or the last meeting, you said the Labour is a far right party. Yeah. And I'm not sure that's right, but I do think that there is a charge to the right going on, actually, which is really concerning. A bright light, though, I think, in a dark sky, a bright star in a dark sky, is the emergence in the United States, in particular, of this mass movement in support of the Palestinians, which is truly something new, and is something that we have to understand and analyze and think about what that means in terms of building an international kind of socialist or communist left.
Thanks very much, Will. So Andreas has also had to go, but again, another encouraging chat. I have to head off, comrades. Good discussion and good intro by Ed, and we'll try to contribute on further discussions when I have more energy. Let's see if Die Linke will last or die. Well, yeah, good question. Will it last or die? Does anybody else want to come in and make any points, general points about Britain? Oh, Minnie, okay, I've got Minnie. But before I call Minnie in, is there anybody else who wants to also contribute? It doesn't have to be 3 minutes. It can be 30 seconds, 10 seconds. But while you're thinking, I'll call in Minnie.
Right. The right wing have hooks. They have nasty hooks. They have, for example, in a local park in our city, there was a group that had a sort of photograph on one of the groups I'm on. There was a store set up and they had yellow branding, just like the anti-vax had yellow branding. And that yellow branding had black words on which read, "Climate change is a hoax." So I've just mentioned 2 hooks there, of the right and the far right. Climate change is a hoax. Vaccines are bad. And then they've got the blame the migrants one, haven't they? Now, I'm not seeing the left coming up with, I mean, they're stupid hooks. They're really, really, utterly cruel and ridiculous. Why hasn't the left got a voice? Broad left parties, as people have been saying, haven't made an impact. We need something different. We really do. Anti-capitalist party is massively required, a mass party, messages to get out. Climate change, do we need the rich? There's a big hook. Why have we got rich people? What's exploitation? What is capitalism? Why are we building up to another world war? There are so many hooks that you don't need hooks. You don't need bait. You just need to get the truth out. But we need a program, and we need a program and a group and a party that people can come towards. Because I'm really, really looking for a party, an anti-capitalist party that can become a mass party that educates people, that says what's going on and puts it in simple terms and puts alternatives like that. Anyway, I'll leave it to someone else now. My 3 minutes is probably up.
Minnie, thanks very much. I'm going to call in Janet now.
Yeah, thanks. I don't want to say much because I think the questions I had were really ones that everybody else has asked about, particularly about electoralism and about Palestine, although I'm not clear actually what Die Linke's position is on Palestine. I don't think anyone's actually categorically said, or indeed on Ukraine. And I think the question I'm going to ask is probably Ed answered when he was doing his introduction, in a way, but just if he could confirm that does he think the problems or the failings or the disintegration, if that's what it's going to be, of Die Linke were actually there inherently from the beginning because of how it was set up, where it came from, how it emerged? I don't know much about it, but I assume from different elements, different parts of activism, maybe from trade unions, whatever, or was it decisions they made later? So it wasn't inevitably going to come to the position that it has. But I think you probably said at the beginning that it was always there, that it wasn't actually going to succeed, but maybe I misinterpreted what you said.
Thanks, Janet. Good questions. Who else has got any points or questions? I'm sure you've all got loads of questions, you just don't want to ask them. I don't know if Toby, you or Jane want to come back with anything about your experiences in Italy, or if anybody else who's not yet spoken wants to come in.
Okay. What I'd say in relation to Rifondazione is
so Toby, what was Rifondazione, Toby?
Rifondazione Comunista, the PRC, Partito della Rifondazione Comunista, the party that started off when there was the dissolution of the PCI, right? The bulk of it went, about 2/3 went into the PDS and the DS, and eventually it became the Partito Democratico when it ganged up with relatively left ex-Christian Democrats. But the minority who didn't accept the liquidation of the party founded Rifondazione Comunista, which was originally a mass party, right? If you go up until 2008, shall we say. And I think the reason that it ceased to be was that it got involved in a coalition, right, between 2006 and 2008. That then caused a split within its ranks. But anyway, the point is that the bit that's remained as Rifondazione is small, but even though it's small, it still does the same, in a way does this, though it's, you know, clearly to the left on Palestine and various other things. It forms alliances every time there's an election. And I mean, an alliance that gets 1% or so is not worth doing. You might as well stand as communists, which they don't do in elections. They're now in something called the Unione Popolare, which is based on Mélenchon's NUPES. But NUPES, you know, I don't want to get into whether NUPES works or doesn't work, but NUPES involved large forces, while Unione Popolare is pretty small. It's an alliance whose there are a number of small groups in it, but apart from Rifondazione, the biggest is Potere al Popolo, which has basically started off as another electoral front that Rifondazione itself had, and they then split from them and sort of united with them again. But I mean, the point is that, and they're now thinking at the European elections of joining some peace list, right, which would be against the massacre in Gaza and would be against NATO's war in the Ukraine. But I mean, the peace list again is an attempt at something broad, that it would involve people who are not Marxist or communist alongside them. But yet it's unlikely to get over the threshold to get anyone into the European Parliament. So that tactic seems a bit pointless to me. The other thing in terms of mainstream politics in Italy is within the PD. About a year ago, that the primary elected Ellie Schlein, who wants in her own way to push the party to the left. I mean, I could go in, there are parallels with the Corbyn thing, but okay.
Toby, I'm going to cut you off there, but I think that we need to get you to do an introduction on Italy.
Yeah.
So we'll get back to you on that. Is there anybody else that wants to ask any questions or make any points? So if not, I'm just going to come in briefly myself, and then we'll get Ed to sum up to the discussion. I think it's been some really, really interesting points raised. Everybody has made interesting points, and I just want to Toby's point about if you're going to stand and get a small vote, you might as well stand as a communist. Well, I tend to agree with that, although I don't particularly want to get small votes. The question is, how are we going to build? How are we going to win? If we always stand under somebody else's program, whatever votes we get is going for that program. And then that program either doesn't do very well or it disappoints. What we're not doing as Marxists, what we're not doing as communists is having the confidence, the boldness to actually put our ideas forward. But in fact, our ideas, in my opinion, the ideas of communism are the only ideas that can defeat the far right, that can defeat wars, stop wars, that can defeat climate change. And so Minnie's absolutely right. We need a party with a program, and a party with a program that can be judged against how much it actually puts that forward. The problem with broad parties and Die Linke is they try to be all things to all people and end up being nothing. And what we've seen recently over the last 20 years, and it's accelerated, is a headlong rush. So in Germany, it seems to me, perhaps Ed will disagree, but it seems to me that the response of the established parties to the rise of the far right is to basically emulate them, particularly on the issue of immigration. Whereas what we need to be arguing boldly and confidently is that you can't stop people going to the alternative for Germany, because people want an alternative if you yourself as a communist don't present a different alternative. People are going to the AfD because they don't see in the established parties a solution, a way forward, a future for them and their families. And what the Marxist left has to do is to provide that. And I think we're in a pretty awful position in this way. In the 1920s and the 1930s, when we saw that sort of polarization, that if you like, people going to the extremes, on the one side, going to the Nazi Party, the others going to Bolshevism in the form of the German Communist Party, at least you had then a big Communist Party. Behind that, you had the Russian Revolution. We don't have that now. We've got no authoritative world organization or anything to point to. What we've got to do is to find allies amongst the existing Marxists and find allies amongst those people that are looking for communistic type solutions and bring them together in a party and then put forward slogans. We're going to have arguments about that. But people are absolutely angry about the elite, the rich, the people that lord it over them. The rich, we've got to get rid of the rich, yes, but we've got to get rid of the system that creates the rich. So we need to develop all of these ideas. That they've been there in our arsenal, in our libraries for 200 years. And we need to make sure that we're shouting about them from the rooftop. And with that, I'm going to call Ed.
Well, thanks very much, Nick, and thanks to all comrades who contributed and gave me more points that I can respond to, but I'll do my best. To return, in a sense, to the beginning, of course, I said that one of the sort of founding touchstones or founding principles of Die Linke was the irrevocable break with Stalinism as a system, and of course that's all well and good, and Stalinism is certainly a system and a legacy which we must irrevocably break with and continue to argue against and explain why that system isn't the sort of communism that we advocate, and it isn't what the communism of the future will look like. But that's the point, isn't it? Breaking with Stalinism, as much as it enabled Die Linke to emerge and to have a justifiable existence, it didn't leave it with much credibility. because of course it had no coherent democratic communist politics with which to replace Stalinism. And if all you do in breaking with that kind of legacy is to slip into reformism, which amounts to doing the capitalist classes dirty work for them, then it should be no surprise at all if, as it has turned out, the working class lose faith in you, if they have sometimes a certain amount of residual nostalgia, even for a system such as Stalinism, or more likely turn towards open reactionaries and the far right, who present themselves mendaciously and cynically as the only real opponents of the system. And so communism has to be a bold and positive alternative which sets itself apart completely from the capitalist system, rejects the idea of simply administering capitalism in the hope of getting small, meager reforms or crumbs from the table. Andreas, in signing off, raised a very important question, which is whether Die Linke will in fact survive. And of course, I could only really sort of touch on the current crisis engulfing the party. But since the departure of Wagenknecht, there are two main consequences really of that. One is that Die Linke will have competition from a new force in the next elections, which will try and steal some of its vote share, while putting forward the kind of so-called conservative pro-working class platform that I sort of hinted at, rejecting what's seen as an over focus of the left on concerns such as defense of migrants' rights, defense of minorities, a focus on so-called identity politics in favor of what they see as the more easy to exploit bread and butter issues of facing the working class, combined with a good deal of hostility to migrants. The other meaningful consequence it will have for Die Linke is that its parliamentary group is on the process of disintegrating. To their limited credit, the remaining leadership of Die Linke have tried to push back against this exploitation of xenophobia by selecting as their lead candidate for the European elections a woman called Carola Rackete, who is a celebrated activist and sea captain who spent many years rescuing migrants from drowning in the Mediterranean. And so putting her forward as a strong pro-migrant voice at the head of their list for the European elections is a belated attempt to issue a corrective to Wagenknecht and people of her ilk, but it may well be too little too late. Janet raised a really interesting point about whether the problems with Die Linke were inherent from the beginning. I think the answer is yes, to some extent. The history of PDS, one of the two main constituent parts of that went into the merger, was of participating in state-level governments. Disastrous record of those state-level governments in terms of implementing austerity and attacking working-class living standards. And although some efforts were made to chart a new course away from that in the merged party Die Linke, which emerged, that legacy has been very difficult to overcome because people won't go so far as to openly reject it. And so that has been there from the beginning, very much so. It was asked concretely, what is Die Linke's policy with regard to Palestine and Ukraine and issues of foreign policy? Well, in a nutshell, on Israel, Die Linke says that it defends the right to exist of Israel and calls for a peaceful two-state solution in the 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital, a sovereign, secure Israel alongside a sovereign, secure Palestine. And so very much of a piece with the establishment foreign policy in Germany. Likewise, in Ukraine, it offers a sort of muted, weak social pacifism, calling for an end to the war and negotiations, without ever going near the crux of the issue, which is, of course, the capitalist system and the way in which it produces war as a consequence of the capitalist system itself. That's never mentioned at all. And so yet another way in which the limitations of parties of this kind are exposed. Ultimately, of course, the point of all of this is not to simply recite 20 years of failures and leave everyone thinking that there's no point trying, there's no point building a party, there's no point organizing the forces of the left. The point is that the whole basis on which it should be done is not this, and it should be something better. The point is that we shouldn't be asking ourselves the question of how we prove ourselves fit and responsible to govern in the capitalist state, but rather how we can use elections, how we can use other tactics at our disposal in order to build support for our ideas, to reach out to those who aren't yet convinced by them, to campaign for the ideas of communism, and to build our forces and bring about the social transformation that we need, rather than adapting ourselves within the confines of austerity in the capitalist system, and seeking merely to get the best that we can under the circumstances for our class. And so that's the crucial difference. So I'll end it there, and yeah, perhaps Nick, if you would like to tell people what's coming up.
Ed, thanks very much. Excellent introduction and summary, and thanks to everybody who contributed to make it a really interesting discussion. So we've got coming up on the 19th of February, it will be 2 years, it will mark 2 years of the war in Ukraine. So Will McMahon, who spoke in the meeting, and you'll have seen before, he'll be introducing a discussion on the war in Ukraine, how it's gone, what it means, what position should socialists take. So that should be an excellent discussion. And then on the 4th of March, we've got the rearranged discussion, which we postponed from a few weeks ago. What should socialists, communists do in the UK general election? And so that'll be an interesting discussion. Do people think that we should back Labour? Should we stand communist candidates? What do we think of all the left candidates that are going to be standing? What should we do? How do we get 76 MPs like Die Linke? I'm just thinking, can you imagine if we had 76 communists in the British Parliament calling for the abolition of capitalism? Wow. So look forward to seeing you, I hope, at those future meetings. We're in the process of developing a new program, but what would help us if you could email in your suggestions. What would you like us to put discussions on about? What would you like to hear? What would you like to perhaps suggest yourself to speak on something? So let us know. And then just finally, again, it's a plea for anybody to write for us. It doesn't have to be long articles, can be short pieces. It can be a TV review. I don't know if people have seen on the website, we carried a review from a former 1984-85 striking miner about the recent Channel 4 documentary. There's a second part going to go up. It could be something that you've watched, a film that you've watched, a book that you've read. We welcome reviews as well as commentary or analysis. And the other thing is, what do you think of the articles that we've got on the website? Post comments, disagree, tell us what you think we should be saying. Again, it all helps to create a discussion and a dialogue. with that, I look forward to seeing you in a fortnight's time. Thank you very much for attending. I hope you enjoyed it. And thanks to Ed. Good night.